So, hello everyone. I'm glad to be with you all. My name is David Cloud. I am a PhD candidate at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. It's great to be here with the Southern Harm Reduction Conference, wishing that we were all here in person. So today I'm going to be talking about a topic that's been on my mind a lot lately, and that's connecting the dots between solitary confinement, reentry, and overdose. So here's an outline of the presentation. At first, I'm going to just briefly review some of the literature and what we know between the connections between incarceration and post-release mortality, and then pivot to discuss findings from a recent paper that was the first to look at associations between solitary confinement and post-release mortality, and then discuss some of the gaps in the literature and start to explore some of the linkages between solitary confinement and potential racial inequities in overdose and other drug-related harms, and then discuss the limitations of that paper with implications and future directions for research. So to start things off, there's a growing body of literature that considers mass incarceration as a socio-structural determinant of health inequities. And this is along lines of race and class at multiple ecological levels. So meaning it underlies inequities at the individual level, at household level, community level, and the population level. We also know that there are different features of the criminal legal system that underlie and exacerbate drug-related harms, things from policing practices to incarceration to community corrections. The fear of punishment is often underlying a lot of the behaviors that translate to risk for overdose and other drug-related harms. Yet when we think about this literature and take a step back, there's less research and little attention to how exposures to conditions of violence and trauma and the microenvironments inside jails and prisons and how that might shape vulnerabilities to overdose and other drug-related harms. That said, we do know that incarceration itself does exacerbate one's risk for overdose once someone is released from jail or prison. There's a large body of studies, both here in the US and internationally, showing excess risk of death due to drug-related overdose, especially during the initial weeks and months when an individual is released from a jail or prison. Ingrid and Benswanger's paper in 2008 was one of the first to show that during the first 2 weeks after release, formerly incarcerated people experience about a 12.7 times higher rate of death compared to community residents during that critical transition period. Importantly, the risk of overdose is even greater at 129 times the risk of death. So there have been this is one paper that kind of tried to unpack conceptually the pathways between the relationship between incarceration and post-release overdose mortality. So box one here, this is a paper by Chaudhry and colleagues from 2019. Box one considers some of the underlying exposures. So thinking about incarceration itself, the example that this model gives is the lack of medication-assisted therapies in most jails and prisons. Box two focuses more on some of the mediating determinants that might be at play. So things in the community setting that might contribute to this excess risk, including a person having a disrupted social network, experiencing psychological harm such as depression or anxiety, social stigma, that type of thing that might exist in a community context. Box three gets more proximal and it focuses on the outcomes that might result from the first two, and is really focused on the individual behavior of a person who uses drugs, such as using opioids, using multiple substances, or using alone. And box four really covers the biological effects of that lead to overdose, such as a person having a reduced tolerance and then resuming a similar dose to what they were using prior to incarceration, which can lead to overdose and to mortality. But in this model, something that I think is missing is really a closer attention to the lived experiences that people endure in carceral environments. So the very specific environmental conditions inside jails and prisons. So here's a way to just think about conditions of confinement in jail and prison and how it might be part of the risk environment. I know some of the earlier presentations in this session have discussed the risk environment, and this is the Tim Rhodes framework. So I'm not going to go into that now, but if we think about what we know jails and prisons are like in the United States, some of the common features are violence, overcrowding, idleness and boredom, disruption to connections with family, poor medical care, and social isolation. And we think about how all those things can come together and culminate and have an effect on the individual. Well, then we think about the volume of people that churn and cycle from correctional institutions in the community. So, from prisons, about 650,000 people annually, and from jails, about 11 million admissions each year, with most people returning to neighborhoods or communities that are already enduring high rates of structural racism, poverty, and social inequities. When we think about this churn and this cycling, this is conceptually a way to think about how conditions inside jails and prisons can culminate to affect community health at a higher ecological level. So now I'm going to turn to, I'm sorry, this is an animation that I didn't mean to include, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly. And so I want to turn to talk about a very pervasive feature of environments inside jails and prisons in the United States, and that's solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is defined as a punishment where people are imprisoned alone in a cell from 22 to 24 hours a day. While they're in this environment, it's characterized by sensory deprivation, idleness, a lack of access to educational or vocational programming, and its really core feature is social isolation. So being completely disconnected, the inability to communicate with family or loved ones or clinicians or friends who are also incarcerated. This is such a dehumanizing and harmful practice that it's been defined as torture under international human rights law, um, especially when it lasts for more than 14 consecutive days. And this is known as the Mandela Rule. So how prevalent is solitary confinement in prisons in the United States? Well, historically, governments have done a very poor job of tracking the number of people who are in solitary confinement at any given time. So over the span of mass incarceration, the last 40 years, we do know that it has increased. There are a few studies, but we also know just by the fact that during the 80s and 90s, when states were building jails and prisons at rapid pace, they were building them with the infrastructure to hold more people in severe conditions of isolation. So 44 states in the federal system now have standalone supermax prisons, which are built to hold people in solitary confinement. And then back in 2015, some public health researchers and lawyers began to collaborate and start to administer national surveys to kind of get a better handle on exactly how many people are in solitary confinement in prison systems. So the most recent estimate we have is from 2018, and it suggests that on an average day, um, between 60,000 and 80,000 people are in solitary confinement at any given time. And this is about 4.5% of the total prison population. I don't have a bullet for this here, but there's also studies to show that roughly about a third of people who are incarcerated will experience at least one stint in solitary confinement during their incarceration. There's a vast literature dating back to the 80s to show that solitary confinement negatively impacts a person's health. This is not surprising given we know about this experience, but most of this work is done by clinical psychologists as well as medical anthropologists, and they've explored and consistently shown that people who endure periods of solitary confinement frequently and commonly display very consistent symptoms, which include emotional distress, cognitive deficits, anxiety, paranoia, And solitary confinement has also been linked to a range of decompensating behaviors and alarmingly linked to self harm and suicide. But it's also been linked to being a form of trauma. So a lot of people who experience it report symptoms that are consistent with post traumatic stress disorder, as well as physical health detriments. Some groups of people who are overrepresented in solitary confinement settings include people with serious mental illness, people who use drugs just because possession of drugs or use of drugs while in jail or prison is considered contraband and often punished with placement in solitary confinement. National surveys also show that younger people tend to be overrepresented. LGBTQ individuals are frequently put there for a number of reasons, often for a justification for their quote unquote own protection. And we know that racial and ethnic minorities are consistently overrepresented in these settings. So, just a little bit more on the racial and ethnic disparities. Again, like the rest of solitary confinement, from an epidemiological perspective, it's poorly studied and poorly documented. But we do know from the recent national surveys and some different state assessments that Black, Latinx, and Native American men and women are consistently more likely to be punished with solitary confinement than white people in state prison settings. In fact, these studies also show the inverse, that white people are generally underrepresented in solitary confinement units. But some gaps in the literature. So only a handful of studies have really started to examine how solitary confinement impacts people once they're released from prison. There's one study done by Hagen that was done in a primary care setting that showed post-traumatic stress disorder related symptoms. But there's not really a lot thinking about this from a deeper kind of social epi lens about how solitary confinement might function to perpetuate drug related harms at the individual and community level, especially along lines of race. So now I'm going to talk about a study that was the first to look at associations between solitary confinement and different types of mortality, including all-cause mortality, opioid overdose death, homicide, and suicide. So this study was done in North Carolina and used data between 2000 and 2016. It was a retrospective study, retrospective cohort study to be precise, and the North Carolina prison system. Prison release data came from the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, and we linked that to publicly available death records between 2000 and 2016. And we used person time, which was calculated by the day of release from prison until death, reincarceration, or at the end of 2016. So the focal exposures we use for solitary confinement include three different ones. So we used a binary measure of exposure, so whether a person was or was not exposed to solitary confinement during incarceration. The total number of placements in solitary confinement was bracketed into 0, 1 to 2, or greater than 2. And the amount of time in solitary confinement, which is based on the Mandela rule. Again, remember, this is what defines solitary confinement as torture if it lasts more than 14 days. So we bracketed that at 0, 0 to 14, and more than 14 days. The focal outcome, we used 4 post-release mortality outcomes. So all-cause death, opioid overdose death, death due to homicide, and death due to suicide. Covariates that we included in the models were a time-varying measure of age, prior incarcerations, whether it was a drug-related conviction, violence-related conviction, whether a person was recommended for or received some type of mental health treatment during incarceration. We included the number of days served during a person's most recent sentence based on kind of the quartile variable. We had a time fixed variable for sex, which was just binary here, just based on the data we had with male or female, excuse me. And then we had a very kind of problematic measure of race, which I'll discuss kind of in more detail. And that was the only ability we had to do was to break it into white or non-white, which on the surface is very problematic. We use Cox proportional hazard regression models to look at the association between this as restrictive housing here. That's a term that corrections departments use. And since we were using their data, we kind of had to use that term in this paper, but that just means solitary confinement. So we did that and with a robust variance estimator to account for person level clustering, and then did a sensitivity analysis to assess more closely the focal relationship. So this table here is kind of our table one, and it shows the differences and similarities in the characteristics of people who were exposed to solitary confinement versus those who were not. So roughly about 33.7% of all people incarcerated and released over this span spent time in solitary confinement during incarceration. And in most situations, about 68% of the time, these people spent more than 14 consecutive days in solitary. If we just look at some of the different characteristics compared to those who were not exposed, incarcerations where solitary confinement occurred involved people who were relatively younger, male, had less than a high school education, had some indication for mental health treatment, a conviction that was related to a violent charge, and served a longer median sentence. Surprisingly here, there was slightly a lower percentage of people with substance use disorders among incarcerations involving solitary confinement, but still there was a very sizable percentage of people who had substance use disorders who were in solitary. Consistent with what we've seen nationally, people classified as non-white were overrepresented in solitary confinement relative to white people. Okay. And this is the association between restrictive housing during incarceration with mortality. This is an adjusted hazard ratio. And here I just want to pinpoint and focus on opioid-related death. And this shows that there was an association between exposure to solitary confinement and higher risk of death during the first 2 weeks that a person is released from prison. So this was the kind of first indicator that there is an association or relationship between exposure to solitary confinement and a person's risk of death during the first 2 weeks from the release from prison, where the outcome was opioid overdose death. So this table again shows the association between solitary confinement and mortality over a 16-year span. So there were a total of 14,086 deaths that occurred after release in our total sample. About 9.4% of these were for opioid-related deaths, 10.4 for homicide, 4.5 for suicide, and then there were 32 opioid overdose-related deaths that were also classified in the ICD-10 codes as suicides. So compared to individuals who were not placed in solitary, those who were more likely to die in the first year after release from all cause, especially from suicide and homicide, but they were also more likely to die of an opioid overdose in the first 2 weeks after release, the same thing that adjusted hazard ratio figure previously showed. So this table compares the odds of mortality during the first year of release for people exposed to 14 consecutive days after the first year of release. So this was another way to look at the Mandela role as the exposure. So the takeaway here is that the more exposure to solitary confinement, the greater risk of post-release mortality, which here, when we looked at it from a perspective of more than 14 consecutive days, the relationship was statistically significant for suicide and homicide, but not for overdose here. Another important finding here is that the association between solitary confinement, opioid overdose was more pronounced for white individuals compared to non-white individuals, which is more consistent with the kind of the community rates of overdose in North Carolina. So just some quick conclusions from this study. So it was the first to suggest that there are associations between solitary confinement and excess risk of death during community reentry. And another key takeaway that I kind of went through those tables quickly, but a takeaway here is that for opioid overdose, the studies found that any time at all in solitary confinement, whether we looked at it from a perspective of ever exposed or not, how many times a person was exposed, and how long they stayed there, there was an association with increased risk of death. Risk of death was higher among people with more placements in solitary confinement, and especially those who spent more than 14 consecutive days. Um, there were differences in the risk by racial group, and they were known to mirror the population level mortality trends in North Carolina. But again, with white individuals at increased risk of opioid overdose compared to non-white individuals. So some limitations of this study. Obviously, this is an observational study, so there's a lack of causal inference in what we can say. Um, Most importantly, here for my interest and the topic of this session, there was a very flawed measure of race and ethnicity in the study measures. So based on the data that we had, we were only able to kind of classify and do a comparison of people who were classified as white or non-white. And a lot of departments of corrections data that I've worked with, you see this as a problematic trend where when people come in and are admitted to prison, they do a pretty poor job in a lot of jurisdictions of recording an individual's race. So this made it really hard to look at, more specifically at whether there were racialized differences in solitary confinement exposure, whether there were racialized differences in the outcomes of interest. Additionally, this model and the data that we had, there were a lot of unmeasured constructs that seemed particularly relevant that might have confounded the relationship that we couldn't control for, such as diagnosis of comorbid mental health or substance use disorder as a basis for placement in solitary confinement. Another missing piece of this is we didn't have or we didn't pay enough attention to kind of the geography or the community where the deaths that we had in our data took place. So were there different types of racialized inequities in the community context and in these communities where people return to after prison, and that wasn't factored into the analysis. So we can start to think about how the neighborhood and the context that a person returns to after prison, how different structural forms of racism at different levels can impact that environment and interact with the prison environment to create a kind of racialized effect. So that was something that we couldn't test with this study, but would be ripe for future research to link together the connections between how prison environments and the reentry experience kind of interact to create vulnerabilities to drug-related harms. Another key limitation of this study was just the fact that this was focused on prison, not jail, and it comes from a single state of North Carolina. So to investigate, you know, whether solitary confinement may contribute to racialized drug-related harms when upon release, we definitely need to incorporate much more variance and diversity in terms of the geographies, the jurisdictions that we look at, and have to look beyond a single state to find an answer to this question. So just some other few ideas for future research directions. So I think at a very basic level, there just needs to be better surveillance of racial inequalities and exposure and harms to solitary confinement. So this might be through a number of different methods, through administrative data, through primary survey collection, but just a better way to get a sense of how frequently people are exposed to solitary confinement and how this differs and varies as a function of race and ethnicity. And I think as a logical next step, there needs to be research to understand qualitatively the experiences of formerly incarcerated people who endure different durations of solitary confinement and what their experiences are like during reentry. And this could help us to start to understand potential pathways and inequities between how drug laws are enforced, the prison conditions that people endure while they're incarcerated, and post-release mortality. So this is just a little bit of a preview, and this is hopefully I'll be able to present on this the next time we meet, but I'm going to be looking at this qualitatively in Louisiana. by recruiting a sample of about 25 formerly incarcerated men who previously used drugs to understand their experiences with solitary confinement in a context where there are very racialized uses of solitary confinement. And solitary confinement is more pervasive than it is almost in any other state. And Louisiana being a prison system that is palpably and undeniably connected to structural and institutional racism. So stay tuned for that, and hopefully the next time we meet, I'll be able to talk a little bit more about this. So um, just real quickly, while I have a little bit of time, just want to acknowledge my collaborators and really the leaders of the paper that I presented at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, particularly Dr. Lauren Brinkley Rubenstein. So I know I'm over time, but I'm going to stop the recording here, and feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you.